Hello, Connection Groups. I'm so glad that you're able to join us again. What an exciting time where we've seen in our Connection Groups more attendance, more regularity, and especially a more hunger for God's Word and God's people and God's connection. This past week, we've dealt with probably a very sensitive, but also a very needed topic, not only here in Singapore and IBC, but probably the world right now. And that's in the area of judging and criticizing. I think as many of you know that when we say do not judge, we usually are telling somebody else not to judge us. But when we hear God's word says do not judge, we usually are saying, we have spiritual discernment that we'd like to pass on. But I think God knows our hearts. And so He's going to teach us how to address judging. And so He gives a command, do not judge lest you be judged. And then He says, in the way that you judge, you will also be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. So God's word is clearly going to tell us that we are going to have to, when we do judge someone, that in the same way that we are judged, or we're judging someone, it will also be given to us. Now, I think there's some miscalculation on this word and misinterpretation, and it just seems to say we never are to judge, and that's not actually correct. In verse 5, in verse 6, it says, do not throw your pearls before swine. Do not give what is holy to the dog. So we have to exercise spiritual discernment. In verse 15 of Matthew 7, it talks about beware of false prophets. So you have to exercise spiritual discernment. So I think there's a fine line, and also you have to understand the context when it says, when you judge the right way, you use analysis, you use evaluations, you use the Spirit of God, but a lot of times it's your motive. Why are you evaluating, criticizing? And you can do that for the good. In Galatians 6, it says, do help a weaker brother who stumbled. And so you have to understand that he stumbled, but also how to pick him up. And that's challenging for us. So there has to be some exercising of discernment when it comes to being critical. But there is a critical spirit that actually has a contempt, that you look down on somebody else, but also you don't look at yourself in this process. And God is telling us that we have to. Then He gives you two illustrations in verses 3 and 4, what I call verbal judgment and visual judgment, what you see and what you say. And you'll see that in verses 3 and 4. But let's get to verses 5 and 6, because I think there are two extremes that He's dealing with here, is whether we're finding faults and targeting people who have weaknesses and areas that we consider that they need our attention, and so quick to judge on that. But the other part is ignoring faults altogether, that you don't use any discernment, that you use the same approach and the same content and the same teaching as if everyone's the same level, and that's not actually true. And so God is actually using us when we are exercising judgment, God's wisdom, that when we do approach someone, verse 5, that we have to first take care of our own sin. Oh, how quick we are to look at somebody else's fault and not look at our own. Second, when we do, in verse 6, it says when we do approach someone, that we use wisdom in our approach. And that's what He means, don't give what is holy to the dogs, don't throw your pearls before swine. He's speaking really that you have to discern where they are spiritually. And then when you pass something over to them, are they able to receive it? I love Proverbs 15:2 that says, a wise person makes knowledge acceptable. And so I'm going to encourage you, and we do this 100 times a day, we'll have to make a judgment. And either we're going to judge or we're not going to judge. Or if we're going to judge, we're going to judge with an understanding that God will also judge us in the same way, the same amount, the same measure, but also that we are also under the judgment of God. But God doesn't tell us not to put or grab that and extract that dust or that speck out of our brother's eye. We're supposed to help each other, but never help each other in a way that doesn't look at our own faults first and our own shortcomings. So perhaps this next week, especially in your connection groups, maybe you can start between husbands and wives and family members and friends and just look at the words you say. Are they criticizing? Are they encouraging? Are they condemning? Are they comforting and full of compassion? And let's look at our words. I know some of my brothers here in Singapore When they describe Singapore, sometimes they say, sometimes we live in the culture of criticism here, but I don't think Singapore has a corner in the market on that. I think that's human nature. So maybe you can ask someone, am I critical? Maybe you can get some feedback from a brother and sister in Christ that would help you. But let's use this word this week to change our kingdom judgment for the glory of God with an honest assessment of our own heart, but also at the same time that we will be able to minister and help each other with compassion and with compliments and encouraging each other. Have a great week, Connection Groups.